Hello, everyone, and welcome to New Polity Podcast. This is our last episode, Politics of Paganism. I'm here with Dr. Andrew Jones.
Hello.
So, why did we do this series? And I really want to begin with something that's very apparent. Now we're post Trump's victory, that there is a lot of energy, vitality on the right in our politics today. And one of those voices on the right, there are many different voices on the right, is the Nietzschean voice. And this is what we've been addressing through this podcast series, is the Nietzschean voice of reacting to leftism, wokeism, and saying we have a genuine alternative to all of the passive, woke, feminists, etc. thing. Which began, with Bronze Age mindset and I think it was 2022, where the Nietzschean ideas became more kind of prevalent, that this is a genuine alternative on the right. And then recently, which spurred us on to read The Ancients, was Bap's dissertation, Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy. So maybe we could begin with, the state of the right in this type of way, that the Nietzschean, right, this isn't the neoconservatism of before. This is a very different different state in the right today.
Right. It isn't your father's conservatism.
Yeah. Yeah. How do we get there?
Yeah. I mean, it's actually, there's a lot of things that are very welcome in all of this. And a lot of things that are welcome, and that makes sense of the Nietzschean revival, or make sense of why it has such currency. And I because I think the idea of activity, of movement, of building a world, of moving forward, not just reacting, like the kind of notion of the conservative as the one who seeks to conserve or protect that which is already there, that which is old, and just sort of tries to stop the movement of history, right? As opposed to the Nietzschean kind of vitalist idea of no, what the right is actually a movement of construction, of building, of activity, of right, and therefore not just reactive to what the left is doing, the progressive left who are movers, right, trying to build, but are actually a rival to that. Right. And so there's and therefore the political world becomes not this kind of perpetual rearguard action, but rather an offensive action. Right. That there's now a counterattack. And now that I think is awesome and like really interesting to watch. And the way in which, one of the things that's most amusing about it is the way in which the left, the progressive left, is in a tizzy because they can't believe that people on the right are daring to like do things or talk about doing things, or are not regulated by their taboos and their like language games and all of, we're just like, whatever, man, we just don't care anymore about what you think. Well, you're not allowed to say that. That's bad. It's like, okay, see you later. Just powering past it.
Yeah, it's very different.
It's awesome, and it has revealed in a lot of ways. It has revealed the weakness of the power of the progressive left. Right, that it was a lot of it. It has revealed. In some ways, it has revealed the weakness because it has revealed how so much of the social control was based upon dominance of what was thinkable, what was not thinkable, what was allowed to be said, what was not allowed to be said, right? That kind of cultural monopoly. But then, and so that the almost fatally wounding of that sort of power is very welcome, right? I mean, it's so welcome. It's so true at this point that that I was like driving in the car the other day and I heard a radio on the ad, an ad on the radio that was something about like, some woke thing. It was something like some organization that was supporting female-owned businesses or something, and it was presenting itself still as this sort of everyone's in favor of this. Everyone cares about this. Everyone thinks this is important and we're doing it, as if everyone listening to the radio would be like, oh, that's great. And then it was funny to me because I thought, wow, we're still doing that? Like people are still doing that? Yeah. Like, don't you understand that half the population just decided it was okay to not care about that? Do you know, like more than half the population has just decided that's no longer the norm that we live by? Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Now, so that's awesome and interesting. There's some things about it that can be scary, but unpredictable. But one of the things that's also revealed, so there's a revelation of a certain weakness there. But then at the same time, there's been the revelation of the deeper powers, right? That all that linguistic, cultural blanket of control, that surface level control, that if you tear that away, what you're going to find are a whole bunch of guys with guns, and a bunch of money. Mm-hmm. All right, so there is surprise. There is in fact something back there. Yeah. It's not just that, and that's why it has become also simultaneously a little silly, like when again, I was listening to the radio yesterday. I drive my car and I listen to the radio. Sure. This is how I know what's going on in the mainstream, and I was listening to Sean Hannity, who's the worst, and just the worst. Yeah. Just so boring, and he had these guests on who were talking about some stupid movement among women to shave their heads and be celibate or something. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And they were going on and on about it as if that was a cultural phenomenon that mattered. And it's like they themselves don't understand that we've moved past such things, right? Like they still want to talk about how stupid the woke people are. Oh, look at this. This doesn't even make any sense. And this is as if that's still the level on which this conflict is occurring. And and that's easy to pick at them and easy to show how silly they are and how they're just
still
narcissistic,
kind of,
and not understanding that what is occurring, and I think what's in the process of occurring, is going one level deeper here. Like we were no longer fighting. That was the fight that was occurring on the surface level of the substrate of the old regime, right? And now, if things work out. Who knows what'll happen here? Who knows what'll happen? Anything could happen. But if things progress, it could be the case that that's what's really being revealed is that the conflict is deeper than that, and that's all a waste of time now, right? And it's missing the point, mm-hmm. Right? We no longer care about such things.
I like how you brought up. It really is a time of a battle over construction now, mm-hmm. Right? So if the Nietzscheans used to be a voice in the kind of movement to do the culture war, battle the wokesters, you say this type of thing. Now it really is a battle of what is the world that the right wants to build. Mm-hmm. Like, what is the positive construction of what the political order should be? And if we're stepping back and looking at our full series, what we I think demonstrated is that the Nietzschean alternative will fail.
It will fail.
And doesn't work.
And it will fail. It has been tried before. This is the thing, there's a great temptation. I understand the temptation. There's a great temptation toward reacting to the regime under which we live with a Nietzschean approach, which then kind of spills into a sort of neo-fascist kind of conception of politics. And I don't mean that as some sort of slur, like the way the left would use it, right? I don't mean it that way. It's like fascist. It's no, seriously, let's think about what fascism is, what fascism was, right? Historically. And that there's a reason why that's so tempting. There's a reason why it was so tempting back in the 20s and in the 30s. There's a reason, and that was just a more contemporary iteration of a temptation that has resurfaced over and over again throughout history. And I think that Nietzsche is perhaps the best philosopher, along with some of the postmoderns, of understanding why that fascistic temptation is so pervasive. But the thing is that the problem is that it will fail, right? it failed. It has always failed. The fascists of the 20th century failed. The fascistic type stuff before that failed. Right? Like it won't work. And I think and it's undesirable. I mean, it's not like we would love to have it, but it doesn't work. I mean, it doesn't work because it's not the promises that it makes won't be delivered.
Yes. And that was what, and people have some confusion about what we meant by pagan, right?
Yeah.
We don't mean kind of the fairly strange revival of neo-paganism in like very recent times. We don't mean, what we mean is a world that is ultimately closed, that within its own resources, it can't go beyond itself.
Right. That's right.
And because that's the case, because there's no intervention from above, from God, the city is totally closed. And when it's closed, what we were seeing with Plato and Aristotle, let's take, for example, Plato's regime forms, that one of the Nietzschean assertions is that this warrior band aristocratic who rules over the whole of the city is basically that is the ideal they're striving for, is this aristocratic warrior band thing. But as we went through Plato's Republic and the denigration of the regime forms, when the warrior class actually has to rule the city, they instantiate a law. And over time, that law denigrates, where no longer they are the aristocrats, but now it's just they're oligarchs. And then eventually, as they have to cede more ground to the people, it eventually becomes a democracy. And then eventually, from that democratic nomos, you have the development of the tyrant, and then you have a weak regime, and then it falls.
Right.
And our critique of the Nietzschean alternative in this way, the Nietzschean position, really is that they're valorizing one part of that regime form cycle and then just ignoring that it goes down the cycle.
And just not understanding that the decline of the regime forms is not that it's based upon the flaws that are present in the beginning, right? So it's based upon the fact that the reason why the aristocratic warrior regime collapses into oligarchy is because it was never what it thought it was. Like, it was never, in fact, what it claimed to be. So there's masks being worn. There's self-deception, right? You think you're this courageous, active, conquering band, right? And you fancy yourself that way. But all of that is, and you're sincere in that. But what that really is the sincerity that underwrites the law that you are subject to within the warrior band, right? Like actually within the band of thieves, within the band, this is Plato talks all about this. There's already a law, a justice, a deep law that is structuring you. Nietzsche knows this, right? And a custom, and that internally you are already constructed as one who lives within that. You're not constructed. You're not actually this sovereign actor that you fancy yourself to be. You're actually already within a compromised regime. And therefore the inconsistencies and incoherence that's inherent to that will play out as that regime expands into the next form, and it plays out in ways that are interesting and somewhat predictable, right? I mean, at least that's the Platonic read, and I think he's basically right about that.
Yeah, and the way Plato sets it up, it's like, as you're saying, that internal law that has its inconsistency is the seed for which all the rest of the regime forms grow out of, that internal inconsistency. Because ultimately what we were arguing is that their law is itself closed in a power game. And
it's a power game internally.
It's a power game internal. Yep. So as you're ruling citizens, as you actually construct your regime, the inevitable just weight and physic of it tends towards the mass.
Always.
It tends to the raw power of the masses.
Raw power, right.
So even if you set up your knightly aristocratic regime and you make yourself out to be gods and you're putting on the mask, eventually the movement happens at some point.
It must, because the like you're saying, just the sheer power of what's now available to you. Do you see, like the thing is about power, and this is I'm going to try to explain this, I guess. But one of the things that we've been describing or trying to describe is the way in which the worlds in which people live are human constructions. And those worlds, then, if you think about the world, the kind of explicit world in which we live, the world of language, the world that we can label things and show how they react with each other, that world has you can imagine it as sort of a closed system, a sort of closed linguistic, symbolic, cultural system that makes contact with the material world in the artifacts that world creates and the structures and the systems that world creates. Right? That world is, if it only has the resources, it only in of itself has the resources that it has. I mean, it doesn't have, within its own context, it doesn't have the ability, simply because it doesn't have the resources to move beyond itself, right? Which means that the move for power is always a dismembering of what's inside it. Do you see? Like, it's always an attack on its own components. So when the world, so what I'm saying is that, what I'm trying to say is that when that aristocratic regime that has its own power dynamic internal to it, its own little world, that is, when it conquers people, so it gets bigger and has more power, the same contextual world, the same conceptual world now has a lot more resources, like material resources. But there's no way that it's inevitable. It's actually almost like laws of physics inevitable that the world, the phenomenal world of the aristocrats is now going to attempt to assimilate that increased material power, including the human beings that are within it, into its conception of the world, right? But that destabilizes and destroys that world. Do you see what I mean? It renders it, the equilibrium that it had is gone. Do you see? Yep. Okay, so it moves into the next. It always but it always moves into the next form. But the next form is a degeneration because again, there's nothing coming from without. It's only an eating of itself from within.
Right. Right. And what we were describing with the Republic and with Aristotle's Politics is they're trying to solve that problem of where do you get the extraction, where do you get the surplus, how do you and for Plato it's you have to have war with outside of the city.
Yep.
So you have to extract outside in order to, because Plato's goal is to have the city be totally unified under, the philosopher king and the and so you extract from the outside the surplus that you need to support the inside. In Aristotle's regime with the natural slaves, you have the extraction coming from
you move the within. You move the perpetual war into the city. Mm-hmm. You attempt to. They don't work, neither of them.
No, and Plato, I think, is a little bit more apparent.
He knows that,
forthright with it, that this doesn't actually work long term because there's always breaks in the mechanism, and there's nothing. The city itself is not moving into a higher participation. It's for Aristotle, the statesman, the one true statesman philosopher, he's supposed to be like contemplating and therefore gaining some surplus and contemplation from above. Mm-hmm. But he could just be wearing a mask, right? And actually he is.
He is. Yeah.
He's faking being the true philosopher king priest.
Right.
And because of that, because he's faking it, it
this is clear.
I mean,
this is clear in both Plato and Aristotle. I think when they have, in the end, the rulers becoming the priests, and especially in Plato, when the rulers, the guardians, ultimately become the priests, and yet earlier in the Republic, he tells us how the myth and all of that we pretend like the gods, we pretend like it's the gods, but it isn't really. We pretend like the myths come from the gods, but they don't. We pretend, like they actually come from the legislator. And then at the end, the guardians become the priests who maintain the mask of divinity, but it's a lie. It's not true, right? And so what are they actually doing? It's like, well, they must actually be what they're trying to do would be to try to keep a perpetual motion machine running, right? If they're well-meaning, right? If they're tyrannical, what they're going to do is try to dismember it for their own gain. Both fail. I mean, both destroy the city.
The priests are trying to dismember.
Yeah. So they're either tyrannical and dismembering it for their own gain, or they're attempting in futility to keep a perpetual motion machine running. Right.
And so the valorization of the warrior in the Nietzschean thing here, and we were discussing this, that for Plato and for Aristotle, the warriors become the priests when they get older.
Yeah, there's a sort of pitifulness to it, isn't there? Because it's like, you think about how Plato talks about the warriors and the guardians, and how they're brought out of the cave. The people are brought out of the cave up to see the good and like to be elevated into truth and philosophy for a certain amount of time, and then they're sent back down, and then there'll be the warriors, and then sometime later they're brought up again and shown more truth, right? And then sent back down, and ultimately to become the priests. So the warriors are instrumentalized. The warriors are the world in which they live, the world of glory and honor and courage, is just a law, a mythical law that the men above them have created in order to manage them, so that they do the thing they're supposed to do, right? But once they achieve a certain maturity, they're initiated into understanding that, right? Well, there is a deep humiliation in that, isn't there? That like your youth, your period of glory was a farce.
Yeah.
And if there's a deep humiliation, then there's a deep bitterness, and even hatred now towards the city. And so you can see then how the ruler, the priesthood ruler, can be developed. You can imagine now, I think, an envious sort of envy of the warrior, because that was like his glory days, but then also a hatred and a sort of a recognition of the sham of the whole thing, and therefore a sort of cynicism about it.
Oh yeah, totally.
Right?
And Nietzsche sees this in Genealogy of Morals, right? Like the battle between the priests and the knightly aristocrat.
Yeah, what he doesn't do is make them the same people.
No,
which he
right.
should.
Yeah. Well, I think it's because he has Christianity in mind, but doesn't understand how priest and knightly aristocrat work together. But we can get to that.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, he doesn't understand that in the pagan context, the warriors become the priests.
Yeah.
And because of that, this is a difficulty for many like soldiers and warriors, is that they realize, oh, I was being utilized.
I was used. Yeah,
I was used.
I mean,
it's
a trope. It's a trope, right? Of like the Vietnam vet, the guys who went to the Iraq, Afghanistan. I mean, it's become such a truism that like you how many country western songs. I mean, it's just like about how you went to war and then came home and realized it was all a lie, right? That's
your glorious warrior aesthetic that the Nietzscheans are asserting. The common experience of it is realizing you were ruled within a myth and a nomos of old people utilizing for their benefit.
Yep.
That's a terrifying realization.
Yeah.
And for Plato and Aristotle, that is where the priests go to spin the myth, to keep the machine, keep the machinery going.
Right.
So again, it's almost like the Nietzscheans get something right about construction and building and glory and
I think
they don't actually vitalism, action, whatever. But in the end analysis, it is another reaction. You're within someone else's nomos. You never actually broke the tablets. You're still within it. And the question then again becomes, what is the proper construction and the proper ordering of the world?
Yeah.
I mean, they don't have the resources.
You said about breaking the tablets, and I think maybe there's something to talk about in there where, in Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche talks about the domination of custom, and this is what Bapp will refer to as something like totalitarian democracy, or the sort of the domination of this customary regime, which the way Nietzsche will describe it is that it renders human beings homogenous, it renders us calculable, it renders us sameness, right? And the reduction of people into this domination of this custom. And the thing that's interesting about custom, right, is that we're not talking about positive law, we're talking about the phenomenal world, the customary law as the assumptions of the people who live within the world about the way the world works, unreflective assumptions, right? Like they don't, a deep custom is not perceived as such. A deep custom is perceived as nature itself, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so to be subject to that world, and then he talks about the man who breaks out of that and discovers his own freedom against that, and breaks through the custom, and then is the sovereign individual whose will and his freedom is his own. And then how could he not feel superior? Nietzsche asks, right? But that's very like pretty and romantic and sweet, and it's like a nice picture. But if you actually think about it philosophically for a second, it's like, well, where does this man get the resources necessary to break the phenomenal world in which he is constituted, in which he comes to exist, in which he's born and raised and lives? And it's like, well, if those resources, if we don't posit some sort of magic trick, then those resources must come from within, not from without. And if that's the case, then the breaking of the tablets it must be based upon a deeper, more fundamental set of tablets. Right, so it's like you perceive yourself as breaking the custom. You like you're the rebel against it, and you're doing it. But really, what you're doing is you're crushing a more complex instantiation in favor of a more simplistic instantiation of the custom, of the law, right, of the world. And so it's a reduction. It's not an expansion, right? And that reduction. So for example, you might reduce. I think of this as like an ideological reduction. This happens with ideologies all the time. And so you see a complex phenomenon.
And then you simplify it.
And then you simplify it to some more fundamental law.
Right.
All right. Oh, look at this complex phenomenon of human interaction. And then you'll reduce it to self-interested, rational, utility maximizing individuals. All right. Yep. And you're like, I've destroyed the customary law. Look, I've revealed how it works. And it's like, well, no, what you've actually done is reduced it. You haven't expanded it to something bigger. You've reduced it to something smaller. And what you've not done is you haven't gotten rid of the homogeneity. You've increased the homogeneity. You've actually made man more standardized, more predictable, more calculable. Do you see? Because you've reduced it to some more fundamental law that was already present in the bigger law, the more elaborate customary law, mm-hmm. Right? Okay, so you've just, and I think that reduction can then create the illusion that you've freed yourself, right? Because you've freed yourself from the more elaborate instantiation, but really you've actually enslaved yourself to a more fundamental law, which will then play out even further in frustration and the inability to achieve this freedom that you imagine, and then the reduction even further. And it's like, well, where does the reduction end? And it's like, well, I mean, I suppose it could end in the reduction of man to nothing but an animal, the complete destruction of rationality, in which case the law of instinct dominates without any gaps, right? Without any ability to be further reduced. And at that point, we have perfect homogenization. Everyone is exactly the same. Everyone is just a dog with the same set of instincts, right? And so freedom is completely destroyed. And so there's this like the reason why this is so alluring is because it's not wrong. Okay, but this is where I think we're going to get to something that's kind of complicated, is that the breaking of tablets, so the breaking of the law, like we've talked about this when we talked about Thomas, there's two sides of that. So if you imagine a sort of a phenomenal world, a world that has some coherence to it, has a law and people are living in it. Well, there's breakers of that you can conceive of breakers of that both on the side of moving it deeper in deeper into truth. So the side that's attempting to make it more complex, more sophisticated, more intricate, and so therefore more capable of handling truth. There's breaking that's occurring on that side. And then there's also breaking that's occurring on the reduction side, on the criminal side. So you have like the true statesman side who's breaking going forward, breaking the tablets. And then you have the criminal side, the reduction to a more basic law. Right, the criminal is breaking the tablets underneath the law, not beyond the law. Right, like it's really the case that we're all just selfish. Boom, lower. So I'm a criminal. Do you see what? Right.
Well, we really understand it's all about money. So
it's all about money. So I'm going to get money. So we really understand, and that's a criminal breaking, and to not be able to distinguish between those two is the phenomenon of the people in the regime, right? Like the people in the regime, and this is played out, I think, in Plato. I mean, he discusses this, how tyranny and philosophy, the philosopher king and the tyrant appear to the people as interchangeable, right? That and the criminal, and the criminal is the place, the criminal class is the place where you get the manpower you need for the tyrannies and all this kind of stuff. So he has an understanding of this, but to the people who live simply within the law, within the city, they don't have the resources to distinguish between the criminal and the statesman, right? Okay, but for the Nietzscheans to then and to then say, and therefore there's no difference between the two, it's like, well, are you guys like, well, that's the position of the people who are just subject to the law. Like just subject to the customary law. You're
being reactive to the regime.
You're operating in an entirely reactive posture and not in an active posture. That's right.
And this is like in Bronze Age mindset, the image of the pirate is, Bab's thing. But like, yeah, the pirate, but you're within the regime, right? Like you're just trying to break it as criminal. I mean,
this is, and there's two sides. So again, on the criminal side, let's see how I want to articulate this. The idea of the vitalist idea of the will to power, which I think the way I understand it, I don't know if it's the best. Okay, the way I understand it is this desire for self-overcoming. All right, the desire of strength, which is not just the moving the pieces around on the board, right? It's not just moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic as it sinks, right? But strength as getting controlling fate, of moving beyond the confines of a world in which you find yourself and being able to realize yourself as something greater than the sum of the parts that you were given in the beginning. Do you see like some sort of that? And that's that will to power, the will to freedom, the will to self-transcendence. And I think that it would be impossible for me to agree more with that as the experience of happiness. I just think that, and when Nietzsche talks about that as being happiness, I think he is right, and that happiness then is this activity. It's not a passive repose, but it is this movement of ever greater. Right? Yes. I think that he's just completely right about that. And then, but the if you don't have an expanding world. Right. So if you don't, and we need to talk about how that works maybe later, but if you don't have an expanding world, but you have a closed pagan world, then that experience is actually closed off to you. And what you actually have is the ability to mimic or fake it through a certain sort of behavior. And the example I'm going to give here is something that comes from sports. And that is what we used to call sandbagging. So I used to race mountain bikes. All through high school and stuff, I raced a lot out in Washington. And there are different divisions of competition. There's like the beginners, there's the sport class, there's the expert class, there's the elite class. Okay, there's classes. And they're self-sorted, right? So you, at least they were. I don't know if they're more complex now. But when I was growing up, it was still the case that you entered the class that you thought you should compete in. And there were people we called sandbaggers. And the sandbaggers were the guys who should be competing in expert, but instead enter sport and then win, right? The guy who should be racing an elite, but enters an expert. Do you see what I mean? Because he wants to win. And it's like, well, so sandbagging in a closed world becomes a phenomenon, right? So you can, if you are more intelligent, more powerful, more talented, more gifted, more perceptive, so you're desiring this sensation or this feeling of freedom, of overcoming, of all. Well, the real thing is to move out deeper, but you can fake it sort of by moving in and sandbagging. Right. So if you have that idea of the city as this thing that there are leaders on the front end who are moving it deeper into truth, deeper into participation, or there's criminals on the back end who are dragging it underneath it. Well, you sort of have this phenomenon of the guys who the guys who ought to be leading it forward, the statesman, the potential philosopher. And this is where Plato talks about how close the philosopher and the tyrant is, right? The potential philosopher who, instead of pushing out, turns around and goes in and has that feeling of domination, that feeling of overpowering the weak, the relatively weak, the feeling, Nietzsche talks endlessly about cruelty, the sensation of cruelty that I dominate this one and I feel powerful and it's like, and that's all just a big elaborate discussion of punching down. Right. And it's like, yep, you can do that. You can beat up a little kid. Sure can. An old lady. Absolutely, man. And it's like, you can do that. The masses who are just within the law, that just exist within the law of the city. Yep. You can manipulate them. You can hurt them. You can gain power over them. But the interesting and you can think then, you can have a somewhat of a feeling as if you're participating in the will to power, as if you're moving into your own fulfillment, but you're not, right? What you're absolutely not. What you're actually doing is reacting to the power that's there. So and this is important, right? Because for understanding Nietzsche, because Nietzsche talks about these two forms of the genesis of morality, right? The aristocratic and the slave. One is active, right? One is the one who is good in of himself. Who good is the first thing, and it is just an identity. I am good because I am the one who is powerful. I am the one who has activity. I am the one in act, right? I am the one moving. The motive force of things, and that is good. And then that goodness, it becomes aware of the things that are static, the things that aren't moving, the things that are lower, and that becomes bad. But the bad is unnecessary to the good, right? The good could exist conceivably without the bad. The good is self-sufficient. The bad is sort of a secondary thought to it, right? And then he has the slave morality, which is the inverse, where the experience of the power of the other, and that the one who is more powerful than you, and you're the weak one, and the one who's more powerful than you, his preying upon you, or his imposition upon you, his power upon you, is what you in the first instance experience as evil, right? And so evil becomes the primary, the prime term in morality. They are bad. And then the good becomes secondary. I am good. I, the weak, am good because they are bad, right? So that's a passive and reactive conception of the good. The good is secondary to the evil, whereas and that's a posture of passivity, right? Of receptivity. I'm receiving from the active, and therefore the passive component is what's good because that's me.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So this is what I'm trying to say is that when the would-be aristocrat, the would-be statesman turns inward and sandbags, right? He's not he's not he's not living that aristocratic sort of morality that Nietzsche describes. He's not living good in of himself, right? The movement of himself in his own self-sufficiency. That's not what's occurring. He's actually reacting to and participating in a struggle. He's adapting his activity into the world of mere raw power, right? So instead of the will to power, which is this movement into fulfillment, he's in the reactive world of the competition of power, right? The competitions between powers, which is the world of the slave morality, right?
Yeah,
relative powers and the struggle and the like he talks about the slaves are clever and the slaves figure out how to protect themselves and because they're in a world of a sort of zero-sum game over the managing of raw power. Whereas the true aristocrat is not in a zero-sum game over the managing of raw power. He's the creator of new power, right? He's the mover into new space, right? And that's why it's good in of itself. But when you sandbag, you're not doing that, right? So you're participating. You're instead adapted what could have been a movement into the will to power down into the struggle of the zero-sum game for power within the city. And so you're reactive yourself.
Yes, and you are participating in the same resentment that the slaves
Oh, you're the master of it. No one hates more than that guy. Nobody has more is more fundamental to his value system, the hatred of the small, the hatred of the little, the hatred of the simple, the hatred of the naive, the hatred, right? Like that becomes, and ultimately there's a sort of envy in it, but that becomes the basis of your morality. It's a complete inversion. And I think this is incredibly clear in Nietzsche, like where when you read him, like read the genealogy of morals, and it's like, it is obviously the case that his hatred of Christianity is the basis of this whole system, not the other way around.
Right.
Right? Like the resentment would be like the way to describe the book. It's like, here is the ultimate example of resentment.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and that is that sandbagging mentality, you see. And I think I think that's the way to understand it. I hope that makes sense. But the problem, and so here's the thing, is like, I think that Nietzsche's not wrong. I think his psychological insight here is very brilliant and very true, right? That there are these two different movements. There's the passive and the active. There's the reactive and the creative. There's the morality that comes out of the positive and a morality that comes out of the negative, right? Like both of those things, both those movements occur. But what I would want to argue is that what Nietzsche's describing in his own idiom is the two movements of the spiritual soul itself, right? The movement of receptivity and then activity, the movement of obedience that then leads to power, to authority, the movement of receptivity of grace that then leads to the adventure of world creation, right? That those two movements are the very functioning of rationality itself, the receptivity of the form that's greater, the universal that's greater than the particular, and in order to articulate the particular, right? And the analogy, the metaphysics of the analogy of being, the similarity, however great, which is always offset by the ever greater difference. Do you see what I'm saying? That there's these.
He's describing the activity of freedom, but it's a question of where do you get those resources in order to do that? Where is the receptivity that then allows you to build a greater world? And it seems with Nietzsche's own resources, it's the self who continually puts on like he's greater than he is, but he's actually just trying to manipulate and mine from within.
And it doesn't work. And I think Nietzsche knows this. I mean, don't you think? I mean, we were talking about this the other day. That as you go later in his career, it becomes ever more evident that he knows that he's a fraud.
Yeah, he knows he's not Zarathustra. By the time you get to Ecce Homo, right?
Yeah.
I think Nietzsche has basically developed a caricature of himself that he's presented himself in his books, that he is greater than he's the all-wise, basically Zarathustra, who's breaking all the tablets, showing everyone else is stupid, and that you can be truly free, and the future philosophers will hear this call. And we talked about the Nietzschean flattery.
Yep.
But by the time, late in his writing, when we get to Ecce Homo, he's now making fun of his own caricature. Right? Yeah. Like he's now making fun of himself. Like when he's saying, behold the man, I'm the one and I'm the next coming of Christ.
Why am I so good at this? Why am I so good at that?
Yeah, why I'm so good at writing, all this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's a joke. It's funny.
Yeah, because you realize you're not actually moving deeper in, you're mining from within, the people you're convincing to
fools.
Break the tablets, you're making fun of them.
Yes. Right, yeah.
Yeah.
You're making fun of them.
You're in a kind of like... aesthetic self-help group of you're mad about modernity and you want to like overthrow it and be the Ubermensch and be the future philosopher, but you're not. You're putting it on, and you realize that in internal. And it's interesting in Genealogy of Morals, the second essay on the guilty conscience, and this kind of like mining from the interior that you, as power perpetuates, as it gets larger and larger, you realize that as it moves deeper, you realize that even internal to yourself, you have a tablet, right? Like you have internal nomos and law that mirrors the regime.
That's what I was That's what I was trying to get at with that, like the behind the custom.
Exactly, and so you have a tablet.
Yeah.
So you have a splitting of the subject where you're trying to overthrow the inner tablet in your soul, and you have a but on the exterior you have to wear the mask. And Nietzsche talks about masks all the time. You know, give me my mask, and so he's putting on the mask of being the future philosopher basically, and realizing that everyone actually has bought it. And by the time he's at Ecce Homo, he has to make fun of his own mask, and everyone is lesser than him who follows him.
Well, yeah. Now
and you detest the
cruelty turns even to your own followers now. Yeah, because right. You have disdain for them.
And I think it's the same scenario with Bap.
Absolutely.
Like no one actually.
He's mocking them. I
mean, all the people who, and you were mentioning a collection of short stories by some followers of Bap that was just atrocious.
So embarrassing.
But yeah, it's embarrassing, right?
It was so embarrassing. I read it. I couldn't believe it. Yeah.
Well, it's an imitation of a mask, but you never imitate the mask as well as the one who wears it.
And to not know that it is, right? To like buy into it. Yeah, not know that it's a mask, not know that, not play it, not
have an ironic,
not be initiated into the joke, but to like think it's real. I mean, it's and then for people to like publish it and put it out there and show it. I mean, it's just more cruelty. I feel sorry for these guys.
Yeah, you can never be more cruel than to the followers. You know, like the Nietzschean followers and the Bap followers.
Yeah.
So let's then move to what we were doing with Aquinas. So I think we've, and we'll keep returning to those themes of action and reaction.
I think it's central because I said again, we're laughing and making fun of people maybe more than we ought to, but the Nietzsche is to be taken seriously because at least in some of his works, I think some of his more honest works, like more where he's really trying to be a philosopher, like in Genealogy
like the
of Morals.
Antichrist is not a
right, but the Genealogy of Morals and there's other works, Beyond Good and Evil. I think places where he's attempting philosophical activity and is very insightful. His psychology is immensely insightful, right? Like the idea, like when you read the descriptions in Genealogy of Morals, of the types of human beings. You recognize it in yourself. You're like, yeah, that's right. There is something about me that seeks cruelty, that loves cruelty, that desires it. Just look at little kids on the playground, right? Who are cruel to each other. Mm-hmm. There's something. Then the passive side, the slave morality is like, yes, there's also that, the hatred for the strong, the hatred, right? Like those things are here, right? Like those are real phenomenon, right? And even the description of the course of history, the modern, like that the modern displacing or the modern conquest, the slave morality's conquest over the aristocratic morality is true, and you can see it. Right now, what becomes what becomes very untrue, right, or very a failure of insight. Is a certain stubbornness where there's a refusal to treat Christianity as anything other than yet another myth, right? It's merely Judaism that is merely another myth that has and therefore there's a priori going on where the assumption from the very beginning is that we are trapped in the age of nature, what Thomas would call the age of nature, right? We are trapped in the age of nature. There is no gracious action. There is no God. There is no truth outside of the truth that we create for ourselves, right? And then if that's the a priori, if that's where you are, then the description of how it is that mankind eats itself from within, it's like, well, yeah, man, I see that. That's true. Like that was true in the pagan world. It's true in the modern world, right? That he eats himself from within. And precisely because those two movements, the movement of the receptivity and the activity, the contemplative and the active, right? What we'll talk about, the spiritual and the temporal, right? Precisely because those movements, which are the two movements of the analogientis, the similarity and the difference, are discordant, right? They're not. The rhythm between those movements has no harmony to it. There's a discord. And in that discord is when you get the war between the aristocrats and the slaves, the conflict between these two moralities. Instead of these two moralities being two ways of approaching the rhythmic mystery of the analogia entis, right? The positive theology and the negative theology. The God is this, the God is not what I think he is. The truth is this, the truth is always different than what it is, right? That rhythmic movement that's in Christianity, if you tear those two pieces apart, an attempt for each of those movements attempt to develop self-sufficiency, then you get the Nietzschean framework.
Oh, right.
You get the slaves and the people trying not to be slaves but really are.
Yes. Right. What is required is actually a receptivity from above that then allows you for positive action to build a bigger world, to build something grander than what's there. Otherwise, you're stuck within the motion machine still.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I think that we talked about this with St. Thomas, that maybe this is a good place to talk about that. The two powers. One of the things that you notice about Nietzsche and others similar to him is they just don't know what to do with the Middle Ages. And so they basically just ignore it, right? They basically just leap over it. You go from, I remember the first time I read The Birth of Tragedy, I couldn't believe that, like we're talking about Socrates and like the Socratic move into rationalism. Mm-hmm. And then it's like, and then all of a sudden we're in the 19th century.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's like, whoa, man. Like not only is what happened in modernity it has no direct link to what happened in the ancient world. Like the only way you would be able to connect those two things is if you passed through the Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, the modern appropriation of the ancient is just a purely modern phenomenon, and there's no continuity in the tradition. Yeah. Right. Okay. So then what Plato does or Socrates does is irrelevant to what the modern world does. The modern is working on its own. But okay. So there's a historical methodological flaw there. But if you actually go to the Middle Ages and look at it, and look at the understanding that's developed in the Middle Ages of the relationship between the two movements of human life. So, which are most manifest in the discussion between the active and the contemplative life, which then has its political corollary or its social corollary in the spiritual and the temporal powers. And I'll try to describe is like that the temporal power. This is not church and state or anything like that. That's a total misunderstanding of what it is. It's two movements or powers within the soul itself that then manifest themselves socially, right? Okay, because as the soul, like Plato says, as the order of the soul goes, so goes the order of the society, mm-hmm. right? So to have a properly ordered soul, you get a properly ordered society. But that you have the temporal. Let's start with the temporal. That the temporal power is that power which is building worlds, right? So the legislative power, the architectonic power, the political power, the force that constructs a coherent world and perceives or goes after is attempting to realize ends in the world. Okay, and so therefore the constructive active, the active force. All right, well, left to its own devices, that becomes the construction of closed worlds. That becomes the construction of a closed
Yeah, right.
Wherever you begin and your abstraction is where you end. There's no place to go. There's no concepts that emerge that aren't deductive from the concepts that were there from the beginning. Right. Okay. So so that's the temporal, the active, the builder. But then you have the spiritual power, right? And the spiritual power is that power in society that sees the relativity of what the temporal power is constructing, because it's the power in society that is somehow participating in the universal, right? And that doesn't mean it possesses the universal. That's not what we're saying. It's not like the spiritual power like has the truth. It's like, no, the spiritual power is because we're talking about a healthy human reason, which is always ecstatic, right? Like reason that moves beyond itself. You have the part of reason that is attempting to makes things uniform, make them calculable, make them countable, make them and that's the similarity side of the analogiantis. That's the side of this is what things are, the side of presence, if you want to talk about like postmodern metaphysics type stuff, right? But then that is always being offset by the part of human rationality that is moving past those things, that is recognizes that those constructions may be true, but their truth is analogical, not unifical. Do you see? So
right.
And so the spiritual power is that participation in the truth that is greater than the truth of human construction. But that participation occurs within the human construction. Do you see? Because reason itself has that ecstatic movement to it. So it's not like you have one power over here that's building this world self-sufficiently and then another power over here that is access to the divine directly or something. Like the spiritual power is within the temporal, right? They are human beings. They have buildings and they eat and churches and all this, all the aspects of human construction. And yet it's the part of that structure that is relativizing it, right? Like and therefore, and like this is not God. This is not truth itself. This is not goodness itself. And in that sense, it has there's a negativity to it. Do you see what I mean? Because it lives in the world and it knows that world is not what there's a negative theology. You see, like what is the truth? What is God? I don't know. What I know is it's not this. Right? I know it's not this. What is justice? It's not what we have, right? Do you see what?
And then you can see the Middle Ages as this, as movements within that harmony, sometimes more disharmonious. Sometimes the temporal power, not listening. Sometimes the spiritual calling the temporal power to repent and to change its way.
Well, that's the thing.
Constant repentance.
The very conflict between the two demonstrates they're the exceptions that prove the norm, right? The very conflict between the two powers is that what we're talking about is a rhythmic tension, right? And that tension, so that the spiritual power's activity, which is not only the intellectual relativizing of the temporal, but is also the conduit through which grace is flowing in to the whole, right? So there's an intellectual and a volitional component to it. That, when disordered, can become the kind of bitter priestly slave morality, hatred of the aristocratic temporal power nobles that Nietzsche is talking about. And in the same way, the temporal power, which is that which builds, which if it's receiving from the spiritual power and it has a receptivity, right?
And a humility
to the spiritual power, is now able to have that will to power construction that makes things bigger and more true, more complicated, more beautiful, right? That it's the building power. Well, if it becomes disordered, then it becomes that aristocratic, that like sovereign individual aristocratic turned inwards and preying upon, like, and so a world in which their harmony and their disharmony are always on the verge of like, where are we when are we overstepping one side or the other? And then there's like a sort of correction that occurs. And so you get the conflicts between them, but the conflicts occur in a society, a civilization that seems to need both and desire both and always want both, and so the conflicts are resolved without the destruction of the civilization. So it can't be the case that there's some fundamental conflict or some fundamental incoherence, right? That doesn't work for 1,000 years, no, right? Rather, the conflicts are conflicts that exist precisely because the harmony is tenuous and difficult. Do you see it? Like and it requires both humility and ambition, both passivity and activity, right? Both the martyr and the warrior, right? The monk and the knight. But that is where the desire for the will. So what I'm saying is that what I'm trying to get at is that the two types of morality, the two types of being that Nietzsche absolutizes, totalizes, in the Middle Ages are undermined by their interaction with each other.
Yes, and their place within the ever greater, they realize their smallness within a larger world. They realize that the temporal power isn't the whole of the world, and they're the priests. This is a very important point that in pagan empire building, it is the case that the warriors become the priests.
Yeah, the king is the son of God.
But actually, the division of temporal and spiritual in the rhythmic harmony of what's going on here is the continual. Both the humility of the clerics and the priestly class, that the temporal is the one building, is the one legislating, is the one ordering, and recognition that they're not the builders. Now, at the same time, and that they don't have the full truth that they can just make into a human law directly.
That's the pharisaical move.
The is to make
my law is the divine law.
Is to make it the divine law.
But the clergy do not do if they are being true to their vocation, do not do that.
Right. We discussed that move, the corruption of priesthood in that way. In the same way with the temporal power, the recognition that while they are the builders, it's, if God does not build the city, the builders build in vain, and that it is the case that they have to be humble and receptive to the grace that the spiritual power provides, because that really is what allows them to build further, what corrects their own errors, and also what supplies the grace for those who they rule, to actually be moving the whole city into greater participation.
And it allows for the destruction, the breaking of the tablets to be not that kind of downward spiral, reductive activity I talked about earlier, where you break the tablets in favor of a more fundamental tablet. But it's the opposite. The tablets must be broken. Like the world, there's this great temptation within human constructions to subsist, right? Like to say, this is it, we've built it. And the temporal power on the front end, right, is the power that must always be looking back at the world that they've built and say, we need to destroy this. We need, and like what I mean is this isn't it. Not destroy it like in Revolution. I'm talking about we need to continuously be undoing it. Why? Because it needs to be moved deeper in. It needs to be expanded. And so the new tablets that are being written, which is what Nietzsche says that the active people do, right? The construction of the new, the writers of new values, the formers of new values, the creators of new moralities, the writers of new law. Yeah, that is that temporal power that includes both a negative destruction of what was there and a positive construction of what is new, right? But that what is new is now truly new, not deductive from what was there, but actually expansive. Like it's unpredictable, right? It's not the case that the tablets that were there contain the new tablets, right? The new tablets are new, actually new. And the only way I can conceive of that happening is if the writers of those tablets are being humble and obedient and therefore receptive and therefore reactive to some input from without.
Yes.
Right. So that means that will to power, that the way he describes this ultimate conflict between the receptive and the active is just mistaken, right? It's not understanding the Christian genius, which is that the maximal amount of activity, the maximal amount of activation of our potencies, the maximum amount of freedom is achieved only as the willingness to receive that which is from without is increasing. They move together, not against each other.
Absolutely.
Now that does mean though that the Christians, the modern Christians in particular, that valorize passivity, that valorize stasis, weakness, suffering, without the second movement, right? Without the second movement of therefore world building, therefore activity, therefore power, therefore, right? Without that second movement, well, they're beginning to resemble what Nietzsche accuses them of being, right? So,
totally.
Yeah.
Well, and you can see the skipping over the Middle Ages is in the time of the conversion of the empire. Well, before the conversion of the empire was a period of martyrdom, of suffering, of just that we will be killed, but we're going to witness to the truth.
Right.
And then, okay, the conversion of Rome, and then we have the Middle Ages, which is the attempt at building. It's the attempt at the temporal power trying to actually being integrated into building the city of God, building the kingdom of.
And who is that temporal power in the Middle Ages? It's exactly the barbarians. I mean, this is the thing. It's like
the blonde beast that
it's
Nietzsche
these
talks
blonde
about.
beasts that he's talking about. That the conversion of the barbarians is not their being neutered. The conversion of the barbarians into the Middle Ages is the fulfillment of that barbarian desire to move, activity, conquest, right? That the world is open to my activity and open to my power and not closed down on top of me, the defeating of fate, right? And that heroic posture. And it's like, well, the reason why the barbarians convert to Christianity is not because they're defeated by some sour, prudish priestly class.
Yeah, from Rome.
The reason they convert is because that fulfills that desire within them. It's like now within Christianity as the temporal power, which is the knightly class, which is the aristocratic class in Europe, which are the barbarians. I mean, that's who they are, right? Is the fulfillment of that within the Christian rhythm of the active and the contemplative, the passive and the adventurous, right? And the receptive and the constructive. And so it's that's why you can't, that's why they dare not look at the Middle Ages, because then you have to square up to the fact, well, what happened to these barbarians? Why did they do this? Who are they? Where did they go? Right. And it's like, well, no, they're still there. They're not just still there. Like they're really there.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. You have to explain why they didn't just kill Boniface.
Yeah.
Right. Like Boniface shows up, cuts down their tree and their pagan god, and then preaches the gospel, and then they actually convert because they see it as the fulfillment of all of their adventure is not, and it's not subjugation either to some type of just priestly rule or subjugation to some external warrior force. It actually is allowing them, it's giving them the freedom they're seeking.
There's something really, there's a lot of philosophical that's of interest here. There's also some stuff that's just historically, methodologically foolish. Like for example, the basic idea that the Middle Ages is characterized by some fundamental conflict between clergy and aristocracy is just ridiculous, because the clergy are aristocracy. I mean, it's ridiculous on its face, right? Like no, actually, the one brother becomes a monk, the other brother becomes a knight, right? The same father, who's say a knight, has both, right? Yeah. Like the knights are the ones who endow the monasteries, and their sons are the ones who go to them. It's not some like fundamental tension between two irreconcilable approaches to human life. That's not true. What the truth is actually much more complicated and subtle and difficult, because you have to see how is it that these two things coexisted, and that like these two ideas coexisted, and then you have to ultimately open up to an analogical metaphysics, an idea of metaphysics of participation, a conception of history, a dynamic conception of history, all things that are ultimately humbling and therefore not desirable to the stubborn.
And just to take an example of the Franciscans, the Dominicans during that time, the need for constant reform of the relation of the spiritual and temporal. And it came about in a time in which there was a kind of starting to be a corruption of the priestly into the temporal in a perverse way, or just not really, being in a state of constant conversion. And what is St. Francis and Dominic's, main goal, if not a total conversion, putting off of this and moving into something deeper, returning to what Christianity, the power of that is.
But what's really what's very interesting about both those guys, and very confusing to moderns, including modern Christians, is that they're both reformers who seem to be reforming on the clerical, more on the sort of side of the priesthood, the side of that, but that's a mistaken perception. Both of them, for example, are directly connected to crusading activities, and huge fans of the Crusades. Like Dominic, the Dominicans are the complement to the Albigensian Crusade, like the Crusade in southern France. Francis himself goes on crusade, and there's this whole sort of hippie version of that where he's like talking about some sort of pacifist thing. Well, this is not true. That's not what happened. He goes and tells the Sultan, you need to convert, otherwise this army here that I support is going to destroy you, right? So it's like they even in that revitalization of the spiritual power that's attempting the revitalization of the contemplative side of things, that is always within the context, or not always, in the example of those saints, within the context of exactly a reform of the active, of the warrior, the world builder.
Absolutely.
Right?
And it's really, it's the image of the cross. Like, the cross is needed both for the spiritual and the temporal power. They both have to realize that it is through the dying to self that you put on the new self in Christ. That we're always being conformed to that image, that what Francis and Dominic do in that time period really is show you how you're too static. You need to be dynamic again. You need to move
be active, and
into the image of Christ.
That idea of activity is important, right? Because like we were talking about earlier, that idea that of God as pure act, and that there's, so the desirability to be like God, or the desirability to commune with God, to approach God, is the approaching of activity, action, being in act, the movement from potency to act, right? And that movement deeper into act is the experience of deification, right? God is pure act. The movement into action is that movement, and that's the fulfillment of the human person. The excitement, the joy, the happiness of moving in further into action, and so it's totally. So again, with Nietzsche, you have this, when you read him, and it's like, oh, this his dream, like what he dreams of as the totally happy man would be the man who's just act, right? Just action. And it's like, yeah, Nietzsche, that's right, man. But you can't be God. Right? Like, you don't get to be the being of pure act, right? Like, the way in which you approach being the being of pure act is opening up your potencies to be activated by that which is an act.
Right.
Yeah. And that's the way in which you move into act. You don't get to just snap your fingers or say some magic spell and be the being in pure act. I mean, that's folly.
And that is how we are participating in heaven even now, is in the movement into the greater, in the movement into God's act and being receptive to that, and our powers growing. That Nietzsche totally misunderstands what the Christian understanding of the beatific vision and heaven is, because it actually is infinite motion.
That's right.
What and like Gregory of Nyssa describes it this way, but our capacity to perceive the infinite God grows at an infinite rate as we receive more. So it is an infinite receptivity in action.
Yeah, it's that rhythm of the analogia entis in hyperdrive.
And because you're never going to reach the end of it, you're never going to reach the end of God as infinite being, as pure act. You're always moving further in, and your capacity to do that is moving further. And because we're participating in the Holy Spirit now, even on this earth, that infinite surplus, that participation in the divine that moves us, that he works through us to do these, to build the world in the image of the city of God, that that is the movement that finds its continuation and fulfillment in heaven.
That's right.
Not this kind of
like
Luther,
suspension.
Calvin suspension, like the world itself is condemned and under sin, and we can do nothing, and we escape.
Yeah.
No, this is the building of the city of God here.
That's right.
Now, with the caveat that we have to be continually humble and receiving and in constant repentance in order to continue that.
Well, yeah. I mean, this is the thing, right? Like imagine. So when we think about the world, if we talk about the will to power, and like we've been talking about it today, and about movement, self-transcendence. So the movement into a bigger world, the creation of a bigger world that you then move into. Well, the reason why there's a sensation of freedom and dynamism in that, and of power, is that the world that is being constructed, that you're moving into, is bigger than the world you're moving out of, which means that you're smaller within it. Mm-hmm. Okay, so if you turn around and sandbag, you get bigger and bigger as your world gets smaller, and you can become more and more like this silly god. You turn around the other way, and you're moving into self-transcendence. You're moving into freedom. You're moving into a bigger, more dynamic world that has more avenues for your action, more openness to you. Well, that feeling then of ascent into freedom is at the same time a realization of your smallness. And it's actually your smallness in that world that is the precondition for the feeling of freedom within that world. Look how big and expansive, how many places I can go. Look how big it is. And as you move in, it gets even bigger. So it's the world of human domination. Holy smokes, man, that's pitiful.
Yeah.
You got to go the other way.
Yeah. I think it's like doubly pitiful, granted the stature of people like Bap and Nietzsche. You know what I mean? It's like they don't even have power to even dominate, but like it's the aesthetic there.
It becomes a mere aesthetic.
And a mask.
Another mask.
Another mask.
Yeah, that's right.
At some point you stop and say, I'm the God of pure act, but you're not. And you're not the infinite resource. And to kind of close this, to move towards a closing of this, that the Nietzschean vitalism, our response is that the only way to move out of the closed world of mining from within that leads ultimately to misery is by the open world of grace. It is by that exact, the analogical rhythm that we're talking about here that only comes about by grace and then the construction of that world, the relation of the spiritual and temporal powers. And as we're thinking about, where we're at currently politically, and, this is a very... This conversation of the Nietzscheans is obviously because of this moment on the right. What we're hoping is this is a communication of why Christianity is actually the fulfillment of the desires of freedom, of vitality, of power, of the movement in constructing a greater world.
Yeah, in the positive, not just the negative, right? Like building it, and to bring back to where we started with this conversation, if we don't want to descend into the failed worlds of the fascist moves, right? Like if you don't like, which is that kind of declaring yourself to be pure act, then we have to come back, and America's uniquely placed to do this because of our deep Christian roots. Like we have to come back into the idea that our power and our humility are bound up together. And I think Americans are prone to that, actually. Like Americans are, in our nature, we're sort of charming in that regard, right? There's a humility in us. And that needs to be cultivated as the source of our power. Right, like it's not that we back off the power. You're not talking about not taking it over. We're not talking about not sticking it to the libs, right? like not going after them. Right? Yeah. Absolutely, man. But that will not work if we're not receptive on the other end. Right? We'll be very disappointed by what happens.
Okay, that's the series.
Yep,
that is the series. Yeah, thank you for
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to be doing a Q&A. So if you have questions, you can leave them in the comments. We'll announce when that'll happen. yeah, that's our series. So thank you to everyone for listening and watching, being a part of it, and hopefully see you in the Q&A. So
Thanks.